And we're going to get this event started. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is the Labor Research and Economics panel featuring three awesome labor economists, Dan Jacoby, Rachel Heath, and Joshua Jacobs. Why I brought you all here today was because there's not a whole lot of dialogue regarding labor economics at the University of Washington. We have a lot of labor studies folks and we have a lot of economists, but they rarely ever talk together. And I know in the economics department, which is where I'm a student, we don't talk much about labor past what are unions, why are they bad? What is the minimum wage, why is it bad? And labor economics is a whole lot more complicated and niche than minimum wage and unions. And so I wanted to bring three awesome labor economists to introduce some of that to you guys. Just a heads up, Yasmin and Sue Young are going to be moderating this event. So any questions you have, feel free to drop them in the chat. Yasmin is who works at the Bridges Center, is in control of the slides. So there's going to be like a 1 to 2 second delay on when I'm done speaking and when the next slide shows up. Please have a little bit of patience. This is, we're trying our best with Zoom. So yeah, feel free to go to the next slide, Yasmin, and see people already introducing themselves in the chat. It's awesome. Cool. So just a little bit about the Bridges Center. If you don't know us already, we're the Labor Studies Center at the University of Washington. We just try to give students an avenue to explore what labor studies is. So regarding social movements, working people's rights, issues that affect working people all across the world. And so we have a labor studies minor. Definitely check that out if this talk interests you, whether it's in economics or not. We have scholarships that are out right now. Definitely apply for them if you're an undergrad. I think there's some for grad students too. And we have internships that's right now not taking applications, but keep a lookout for. I think some people are still joining. So Young, feel free to let them in as they come. My name is Shoaib Lagari. I'm an undergraduate economics student at the University of Washington. So I'm very interested in economics, and I'm a student assistant at the Harry Bridges Center for Labor Studies. So this is where I got into labor and what is it past what we see in the economics department. And it's interesting because everything I saw in labor studies and economics just conflicted. I would never have one answer. It'd be like my labor studies people tell me it's like this, and then my econ department classes tell me no, it's like that. And so it's really interesting to study, both sides of labor issues. Oh, someone talking. Please mute yourself. Yeah, thank you. And if you have any questions, drop them in the chat. But that's about all for me. Today's not about me. We can go on to our speakers. First off, we have Dan Jacoby, who is Professor Emeritus, which means that he's a retired professor, but still active in the labor community, coming from the University of Washington, Bothell, School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences. He received his BA in economics from Binghamton University and his PhD in economics from the University of Washington. He's a former endowed Bridges chair, so he's always been involved with our Bridges Center, and his fields of interest are labor, economic history, and education. Our next panelist is Rachel Heath, who received her BS in economics from Duke University, and then went on to do her PhD in Yale. And then after receiving her PhD, she went on as a postdoctoral researcher at the development research group at the World Bank. And then after that, Rachel Heath joined us at the University of Washington as an associate professor, and her fields of interest are development economics and labor economics. My throat is getting a little dry, but I'm almost done speaking. Next, we have, last and definitely not least, Joshua Jacobs, who received his AB in economics and mathematics from WashU in St. Louis. Then he received his PhD in economics from Duke University, and he's now a assistant teaching professor at UW. His fields of interest are microeconomic theory, labor economics, and industrial organization. So as you can see, the common thread behind all these wonderful panelists, not just that they're very qualified to tell you about labor economics, but that they're all at the University of Washington. We have a lot to learn from them. And so thank you to all three of you panelists for being here, giving some of your time. Thank you to Yasmin and Sue Young from the Bridges Center and the Bridges Center overall for helping host this event. And I think we can go on to the agenda. So just a quick recap of what's going to go on today. We already did introductions. Dan Jacoby is going to tell us a little bit about apprenticeship and what that means, because I'm not even too sure myself. And then we have Rachel Heath on labor markets in India, which is very fascinating. I already looked at some of her slides and I'm excited. And then Joshua Jacobs on income share agreements, or in other words, how can we help students afford university? We'll have a Q&A at the end of the session. We'll have a Q&A at the end of all three. My only ask for you is please, please, please ask questions in chat throughout the event. All good, Yasmin. And if you have a burning question, you can ask it at the end of someone's presentation. I really want this to be for you guys to learn as much as you can about labor economics. So ask anything, even ask the basic questions that seem like they're obvious. I promise you someone else probably has the same question. So really just ask all of your questions, learn as much as you can in the hour and a half that we have these three amazing economists. Okay, and without further ado, I'll let Dan Jacoby go on for his presentation on labor economics and apprenticeship.
Well, thank you. And Shoaib, thanks for doing this. You are absolutely right that economists don't get together and talk. We just assume things. And so it's a great opportunity actually to meet some of my colleagues that I haven't met before. So I really appreciate that. And it's the kind of event that should happen more frequently. And it's something that as I was chairing the Harry Bridges Society or Center, we tried to bring in more and more people and have more and more conversations, but it was always difficult to get economics folks involved. And so I think this is a great, I'm not sure what that was, but I guess we could go on to the next slide. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about labor economics, and then I'll save that for the rest of that for questions afterward, and I'll talk a little bit more about my research. So we can go on to the next slide from there. So just in my way of thinking about the world, I was always a person very much like you, Shoaib. When I was studying economics, I didn't have the same attitude that everybody else did. I think part of what happened was that I grew up in the 60s and 70s in New York, and it was a time when everybody was protesting, and a lot of folks made assumptions about what was wrong with this society. We assumed that capitalism was responsible for both the war and all the civil rights problems that happened in the society. And when I got into college, I took some economics, and it forced me to reevaluate exactly what it was that we were saying and what it was that we meant when we said things like capitalism was responsible. And so my personal battle was one of trying to figure out just where I stood on those kinds of issues. And for me, economics was just this huge clarifying exercise where I was at war with the field that I was studying. Sometimes it won and sometimes I won. And the result is what you get today. So that's my background here. I would just say that what is important about economics is that I really do believe that it gives you tools for thinking about how the world works. And it gives you ways of predicting, and it gives you ways of trying to anticipate events that are incredibly important. It starts from assumptions that are probably not very realistic. And I think oftentimes people take those unrealistic assumptions a little bit too much to heart, and it creates some real problems. In particular, I think one of the things that we find is that people start from the assumption that people are self-interested, which is, I think, actually totally fair. But the question is, what does being self-interested mean? We're all part of families, and oftentimes, being self-interested is caring about members of your family. Being self-interested for some people means going to war and fighting for your country. So that the whole idea of what self-interested is becomes really open to different kinds of interpretations. But it's critical that economics start from that proposition that we're self-interested, because you have to be able to make some kind of behavioral statements. And the idea that you're self-interested says essentially that if you raise the cost of something while the benefit remains the same, you'll probably do less of that. And if it raises the benefit of something while keeping the cost the same, you'll probably do more of it. And that gives you a way of predicting. The problem for most of us as economists is that we don't really know how people regard what people think of as a cost and what they think of as a benefit. But if you take economics seriously, what you find is that you can begin to make predictions. And if you're open to it, then you can reinterpret things in the light of experience, in the light of what you find, so that when we start thinking about what a cost and what a benefit are, we can reevaluate those things and understand people better over the longer haul. I'm not going to talk about these subcomponents here for the moment, because I think it'll take us a little bit too far afield, and I'd like to move on to the next slide. Here we go. So when we look at economics, for me, labor economics is probably one of the more humanistic elements within economics, because it's hard to talk about people and not be concerned about them, even though on the whole, when we think about economics, what we're thinking about is that economics is a discipline. And as a discipline, most people tend to think that the discipline is a positive statement of what we can show to be a fact or not a fact. When we start talking about value judgments, we have some issues about how does that work its way into economics. I personally think that when you study labor economics, you almost always end up eventually, sooner or later, as an advocate for something. And that is to say that you have some value judgments that you think are important to you, but you have to be able to separate when you're advocating for something and when you're analyzing something. And what labor economists, particularly, I know for myself, when we advocate for things, we try to figure out what are the most realistic solutions that we can come up with, and how do we use the tools of economics to get to those kinds of situations. So it's not enough to say, how do people end up poor? But for us, I think we do want to think about, can we figure out ways to eliminate poverty? Or it's not enough to say how to, that sometimes people discriminate, but the questions are, how can we try to eliminate that discrimination? But what we always want to do is to be guided by reality to try to understand what has the greatest prospect of success in those kinds of activities. So those are some of the things that I think about when we move into this field. If we go on to the next slide, you'll probably see a little bit about how this affects me in my research. Actually, I want to go back just half. Oh, no, that's right. That's where we are. So I've been studying apprenticeship since I was in graduate school. I did my thesis on unions and apprenticeship in Seattle, and it took me through to about 1940. And then I stopped studying apprenticeship. I actually wrote a few papers that I got published after I graduated. And then I kind of stopped studying apprenticeship for a long time, and I've come back to it recently because, again, it's an issue that people are really concerned with, particularly because of the ways in which higher education has become so costly and so risky. And as a consequence, people have begun to think, is there a different way for people to move forward in the world of work? And for me, even this issue of apprenticeship assumes that what we're wanting to do is to become successful in work. And I think in the academy and in the university, there's a tension that exists between the idea that I want to be educated versus I want to become successful. Most of us who are faculty members really get upset when we just hear that our students only want to be successful. We like to believe that you want to develop as human beings as well. But that's a tension, because you're in an institution where you have to spend 4 years of your life. It costs a great deal of money, and you're under a lot of pressure to make the right decisions about your career. I know when I was going to school in the 70s, the world was an entirely different place. School was much cheaper, and college was taken for granted. And oftentimes people spent their entire 4 years in very strange pursuits that were oftentimes very quasi-related to academics. So those are some of the things that I remember about that period of time. But we were really interested in the liberal arts and how do we think about society? And that seems to be less pervasive today, although I think it's coming back. And I think it's coming back, especially as people are in a position to know that they may have jobs down the line. But for me, in general, I've always thought about this question as a professor and as a student is, what is it learning about? Is it about gaining job skills, or is it about personal transformation? And as an economist, that's a difficult proposition, because we usually assume that our preferences are fixed. But if education is about becoming somebody new and bringing in new ideas, then you can't even judge that transformation by economic standards, because all of our economic standards assume that you know what you like and what you don't like, and education is about changing what you like and what you don't like. So only after the fact are you able to say whether this was successful or whether it was not successful. So that brings us to this question about schooling and whether schooling is an appropriate way to get this kind of transformation. Personally, many of us as academics would love it if people would just read and think and work on their own, but obviously that's not happening as much as we would like to have happen. I know when I grew up, there were a lot of craftspeople and tradespersons that we would come into contact with who had tremendously well-developed philosophies, were pretty well read, and you could have a lot of great conversations with people who had a world of experience but didn't come out of college. Now, increasingly, what I'm finding is that people in college have read widely, and I'm not so sure that I find that as many craftspeople outside that have read widely, but they usually have good experiences that they can talk a lot about social issues. So, we want to think a little about those kinds of things, but the issue is there another way of doing it? And increasingly people have been focusing in on apprenticeship, and you'll hear this underlying Biden's talks, and it was a big issue in the Trump administration too, although his approach to apprenticeship was quite different from the Biden approach to apprenticeship. But we want to think a little bit about these things. So if we think about it, learning as growth of skills that make you more competitive, or we think about learning as a transformation of who you are, we can see that both things are an investment in yourself, and that puts it into the economic realm of how do we make these kinds of investments. But it is interesting to think about the difficulties in judging those kinds of investments before you've actually undertaken them, in part because many of these things you don't know whether you like them until you've actually experienced them. So you're kind of going blind right through that whole process. That is unfortunate, especially when it comes to college, because you can go blind through college. You can specialize in marketing, find out that that's not the job that you wanted. So you'll regret that. And then you'll also find that you're heavily in debt. You'll double regret that at the end of the day. So you might want to think a little bit about how do we get a better gauge on these things. What I would say is that apprenticeship offers the opportunity to experience the field, to be paid while you're learning, and therefore you should have some idea that this is what you want to be doing over a period of time. And if you decide that you don't want to do it, then you don't have to complete it and you don't have to move forward, but you're not in debt down that process. You're richer by the experience. You've learned something about yourself, and that's part of the transformation. So I'll define apprenticeship as an exchange of labor for training in that particular context. Can we move to the next slide? So there is this question about apprenticeship that I would argue is specifically an economic problem, because one of the things that we find is obviously apprenticeship isn't that prevalent in the United States. If you look at Germany and some of the other Northern European countries, sometimes you find upward of 50% of the folks who are entering the job market have experienced some kind of an apprenticeship, and oftentimes they've gone through college and apprenticeships as well. So in the United States, we're looking at much fewer apprenticeships, and we want to understand what it is that's going on in those contexts. The ideas that we have to work with that in terms of economics come out of what I call human capital theory, or what Gary Becker defined as human capital theory, which is in itself, you can tell there may be some issues around that wording. Thinking about human beings as capital has always been controversial, but what we're trying to do here is to say that if we treat the process of becoming skilled as an investment, what can we learn from investment theory about that process as we apply it to humans? But because it's human beings that we're looking at, we're seeing some very specific kinds of differences that occur if we're talking about investments in other forms of capital, not non-human capital. So in particular, what I'll argue is that there are general skills, and general skills are those for which there is a lot of competition. So if I think about just being literate, a lot of employers need literacy. So there's a general assumption that people have those skills. And if you don't, there's very few employers that are going to want you. But if you do, then you're at least eligible for a lot of employers. Something like coding becomes a general skill because there are a lot of employers that want that kind of a coding, that kind of a skill. A specific skill, on the other hand, is one that is just useful for one or two employers or a small number of employers. And so therefore, what we'd say is that there's very little competition for those skills. And that becomes important whether the skills are broadly used or whether they're narrowly used. whether there's high competition or not high competition, says that once you get trained, if there's high competition, then you're going to reap the returns yourself of your investment. And if there's low competition, then it's not so clear that there's going to be competition for your skills, and your wages are not necessarily going to go up as a result of that. So you may not be as inclined to invest on your own, and the employer may have to do that for you. So these are the base theories in economics about investments in human beings. The other theories that we want to think a little bit about are that there is a capital market, so that if you're making an investment, oftentimes people don't have the funds themselves. They have to receive funds from somebody else. And if they have to receive those funds from somebody else, then they want to think a little bit about what are their guarantees that they're going to get back their funds and reap any kind of return on those investments at all. So either you're making your own investment in yourself, are you guaranteed of success, or are you not? If you're investing in somebody else, how can you assure that kind of success in those situations? In schooling, what we find is that there's high non-completion rates. They obviously affect the student debt. It makes it risky for both the lender, and it makes it risky for the individual. So what we're looking at is, oftentimes you said that we're not going to do that through the private market, but in fact have the government step in and provide financing for those situations. Of course, if the financing turns out to be for a skill that doesn't pay, or an education that doesn't pay, then students are unable to pay back, and we're left with the kind of situation that we've got today, where people are talking about trying to erase much of the student debt because they found it almost impossible to pay back with all the back payments for foregone interest in those situations. There are also some issues in capital markets about moral hazards that once an employer pays for the investment, perhaps they are encouraged to misuse the employee. Sometimes the employees may not behave in the ways in which the employer wants them to behave. So these questions about providing capital to somebody else so that you're working on somebody else's dime create some interesting kinds of relationships that can create problems in contracting. I'm not going to spend too much time on those right now, but what we would mostly be talking about are these contracting risks that if an employer is encouraged to actually invest in an employee and invest in their general skills, so those are skills for which there is a lot of competition, well, the employers typically under economic theory say, I'm not going to do that because it's the employee who's going to get the returns, because they're going to go out and seek the best bidder and get the highest wages. So they're going to leave me once they've got my investment. And once they do that, then anything I have spent on them will be wasted. And so they would generally say that's not going to be the case. But if they can create some kind of a longer term contract, then it's possible that they might make the investment. And that's traditionally been the avenue of apprenticeship, is that there's been some kind of a longer term contract which binds an employee to an employer in some sense for a period of years, that gives the employer the security or the sense that they're going to be able to make an investment into that employee. There are some reasons why I'm not always sure that that's the most important ingredient of this investment activity, especially if you can figure out a way to provide people with some kind of a job while they are learning, so that they are somewhat productive and they're being paid somewhat at market rates, and then being given increasing skills over a period of time so that you can figure out how to make that kind of a long-term apprenticeship work. Historically, there was a difference between apprentices of young people versus older people. The older forms of apprenticeship were ones where you were binding young people, and it was the parents that were binding the kids to an employer who the kids live with the master in their own house. Those indentures became problematic in the United States. That became kind of an irrelevant kind of situation, but it left the legal world in limbo in the middle of the 19th century, especially after slavery was declared illegal and involuntary servitude was made unconstitutional. So in those situations, what we find is that the United States had to figure out its own path toward apprenticeship, and it never really did for a long, long period of time. And that left the institution kind of a wreck. so that there were no standards. There was no clarity about who was going to be remunerated, how they were going to serve, what the level of skills were, and it made it very difficult to ascertain what the meaning of an apprenticeship was at that point in time. So that's how these things are related to apprenticeship, is that in the United States, there wasn't the will and the ability to create an institution that was protected by any particular party. In the United States, it was organized labor that tried to do that, occasionally succeeded, and when they did, they created union-based
Something went wrong. Please try again.
That's my own computer. They created union-based apprenticeships that were successful, that got people into the trades, but oftentimes meant that employers felt they were too expensive and didn't want to train in other fields. So not a lot of other employers followed suit. So we need to think about what kinds of institutions would create an environment where people can learn on the job if that's what they want to do. Can I go to the next slide?
Hey, Dan, just a heads up, we're a little behind schedule.
Oh, okay. So just in terms of thinking about these kinds of things, I would just say that we've, in the United States, created a law called the Fitzgerald Act, and that guides the investment process. It creates a registered apprenticeship. So when you finished you move on from apprentice to journeyman stage. It requires that wages move gradually upward. It requires that employers guarantee full levels of instruction so that you're not narrowly trained, but you understand the full field. It limits the amount of entry into a field so it's not flooded with people, which tends to dilute the wages and tends to mean that employers look for more specialized avenues and splinter the kinds of crafts that people are in. And it provides for dispute resolution since it's a contract over a longer period of time. So these are the kinds of things that that were created in that environment. We can go to the next slide, and then we'll probably just wrap it up very shortly after that. So I just would contrast what's going on in the United States. In the United States, we have nearly 20 million higher education students. We only have 633,000 registered apprentices as of 2019. So we're looking at an institution that is dwarfed by higher education, but yet higher education is increasingly under scrutiny as to whether or not it is a reasonably good approach toward investing in skills, or whether we can find an alternative. I'll just give you a little bit of what I've been doing. If we look at the next slide. So this gives you a sense of Washington State in the last 7 years. Washington State's been making a press to try to increase its number of apprentices, and you can see that there's a general trend that has increased over a period of time. I've broken that out. In particular, what is particularly interesting is that the number of female apprentices, or the percentage of female apprentices, has increased by about 30%. It's still a minority of apprentices, so it's still a male-dominated field, but the field is making efforts to diversify. Non-white participants have been rising as well. They've gotten to about 40% over a period of time of new entrants. And what we're looking at is that the big interesting point to me is these under 30, because a lot of what we've found is that the older form of apprentices that we were looking at were oftentimes older individuals who'd been in their careers for a period of time. And what we're seeing now is that Washington State has been expanding and pulling more young people in. And that's pointing to the fact that people are looking for that kind of an alternative. But if we look at the next slide, what we see is that the one problem that we're seeing is that the yellow bars are the completion rate for the younger folks. And what you find is the completion rate is lowest for the under 30 group, and it's much higher for those other groups. So the question that we want to think about here is, how easy is it for us to create an alternative pathway to economic success beyond college? And what we're seeing is that while you can bring in more younger people, and we're starting to gradually make it more diverse, we've been not terribly successful in making that as successful in terms of completing apprenticeships as we might want. So this is kind of where my research has gone. But for me, the final question is, and I'm not going to take you on to the next slide, is to what extent does this play into labor union organizing? Because I would argue that for apprenticeships to be successful, they're going to be most successful if organized labor establishes ground rules across multiple employers, so there isn't a lot of cheating around training issues, because there's a lot of dimensions on which they can be cheated. And once they've done that, they also create the possibility of creating greater attachment between workers and unions that hasn't been there in the United States, because people oftentimes don't see what does the union do for me. And if apprenticeship is linked with a union organization, then people say, oh, I got my skills, I got my job, I got my training, and I got my economic independence through the union. And that becomes a really important avenue for them to think about. I can talk more about this later, but I would just say those are the ideas that drew me to this subject in the latest iteration of my research. And I'm still interested in doing more. And just in case anybody wants to pursue that with me, I'd be happy to take on some students who want to do some research as well. So thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing, Daniel. And but we can stay on the last slide for a little bit. I just want to say thanks for shortening your presentation. I know you had so much more details and
I should have been shorter.
More of a story to tell. Hopefully we can ask more questions towards the end of the Q&A. And I already see some in the chat. If you want to, I mean, Rachel Ersted said, appreciate this in the prior chart. Medical assistant apprenticeships have increased through labor partnerships locally. So they thought, or she thought, the increases in each cohort would be higher from 2014 to 2021. And I think Chuck might have had a question. He said, Dan, can you speak to the change where companies have failed to invest in the employees for their future value? And I think you did touch on this a little bit. He says companies have been focused on the short-term values, whereas in the post-pandemic with skills and employees are hard to find given the failure to prioritize apprenticeships.
It is very difficult to get firms to invest in employees, especially in the non-white collar employees. The white collar employees tend to be, there's an assumption those guys are going to stay with them, but firms in the past have tended to think of their blue collar employees and even lower level professional employees as likely to turn over, and they've just been worried about that kind of a process. One thing that's different in the United States than in Europe is that in Europe, there is much more employment security, so it's harder to lay people off. And so there's been an assumption that the employer-employee relationship is an ongoing relationship that lasts for a period of time. And because of that, I think that's been one of the things that says, if we're going to be together, let me make you as productive as possible. But in the United States, we've developed a kind of a disposable attitude toward workers. And if you don't need them at the moment in time, then you lay them off or they quit. And we're not particularly attached. That worked for some fields, but it doesn't work for investing in workers.
Great. Okay, I think now we're good to move on. We still have about like 57 minutes. Should be plenty of time for Rachel and Professor Jacobs to go on to their presentations. But now introducing Professor Heath.
Can everybody hear me? Yeah, it looks like I'm unmuted. So hi, yeah, well, thanks, Shoaib, for organizing this really exciting event. It's nice to have all of you here and interested in labor economics. So I'm Rachel Heath, and yeah, I'll just kind of broadly say, we can go straight on to the next slide. I'll just tell you kind of broadly a bit about my research. So I kind of study labor markets and frequently how they intersect with gender. And, you know, as this slide kind of says, you know, several kind of themes in my research are, you know, what are the effects of job opportunities on women, which women choose to join the labor force, and kind of how do we think about kind of women's autonomy more broadly. So we can go on to the next slide. And so, you know, kind of my research has a bunch of different components. You know, often I kind of, you know, develop new theoretical models in collaboration with, you know, with a theorist co-author, and so, you know, kind of thinking theoretically through labor markets and inter-household interactions is one thing I do. And I, you know, on the data side, I use both kind of data collection. If standard data doesn't allow me to answer the question, I also, I've also done some randomized control trials as well. So you can go on to the next slide, please. This is kind of an updated presentation for that I'd given before, that I kind of put some new results in, but it seemed like a good fit for today. And so so yeah, we can go to the next slide. And yeah, kind of, I guess you saw the title. I mean, kind of broadly, I've had a long running interest in the garment sector in Bangladesh, and kind of as, kind of an example of kind of how labor markets and gender intersect. The industry is largely female, and so kind of broadly, I'll just talk for a little while today about kind of some evidence that garment sector jobs can be really good for women, but kind of can we think of ways in which policy can make those jobs better? So by way of introduction, this is a picture on the left here is Rana Plaza in 2013 in Bangladesh. You might remember it from the news. It was, a huge kind of a tragedy of huge proportion. Over 1,000 workers died when the factory collapsed. And so, it kind of really highlighted some of the, just how challenging working conditions are in the garment industry. Even factories that don't fall down, kind of attention came to workers. Kind of attention was kind of paid to other ways in which these jobs are really tough. But the other picture I've showed here, just a couple months later, these are garment workers on their way to jobs, and so they, even after this really tragic collapse, highlighted some of the safety issues in the factories. Workers were still choosing to go to work, and so it's it kind of both highlights how important the jobs for them are, but also kind of some of the challenges that they might be facing as they go. So next slide, please. So what I'll talk briefly about is first kind of, how garment sector jobs can be good, both for the women who have them now and for the girls who might get them in the future. And then I'll talk about some of my research that speaks to the ways in which kind of policy could make these jobs better. And I'll kind of speak to both kind of some ways in which, or kind of some evidence on, workers might not have full information about jobs, how retailers have responded to, to Rana Plaza in Bangladesh, and then talk about some kind of recently completed and still ongoing research on, women's economic empowerment and how that relates to intimate partner violence. So next slide, please. So, the potential kind of benefits of garment sector jobs on women who, either work in them or could potentially work on them. We think there are kind of several levels at which these jobs are important. So at the household level, there's, important income effects because these jobs frequently pay more than the other jobs that women could get, which are things like, kind of being a domestic worker in somebody else's house. So, that's important. It raises the household income level. But we also think that there are also kind of reason to believe that there are differential impacts on women in particular. And so there's kind of evidence that women's bargaining power goes up, even if they don't take the job themselves. Just kind of having a job option kind of allows them to, to kind of have a higher say in household bargaining. Some evidence, including some that I've done, kind of shows that jobs lead to delayed marriage and childbearing, and also kind of increases say in a very important decision in the South Asian context, kind of the choice of a husband, which is kind of very important for women's welfare. And then, it's not just women. There's also evidence that when women get jobs, there's increased investment in children's human capital. So they're more likely to go to school and their health gets better. So kind of several reasons why we think, there could be these beneficial impacts of jobs on women. So next slide, please. But there also could be impacts on future workers. So, we think that parents take account of the returns to education when they're making, or broadly in human capital, when they're making decisions for their children. So in Bangladesh, before there were garment factory jobs, women rarely worked outside the home. So there just wasn't much scope for there to be returns to education because there weren't job opportunities that for women to put that education to use in the labor market. you might kind of think, well, factory jobs don't need education. They're kind of very rote jobs where you kind of, sew the same garment over and over again. But actually, they do reward some components of education, in particular, the ability to read in English, keep written records. So literacy is important. And also kind of on the numeracy side, the ability to do basic math and kind of follow a pattern to make a new garment is valuable. And we think those kind of things, those broad skills are kind of taught in school through education. So it's plausible that we might see garment sector jobs increase returns to education. But we might see dropouts. There's another paper in Mexico that kind of found that these jobs are so good that sometimes girls drop out of school to take them. So we want to be cognizant of that possibility. Next slide, please. So, do families respond to garment sector jobs by increasing girls' school enrollment? And it looks at least possible. So this is enrollment of children kind of across all ages. So from age 5 to 18, as of 1970, it was low overall and much lower for girls than boys. But so broadly, the period where the garment sector has been rising is roughly kind of since 1980. And that period is kind of corresponds to the really strong increase in girls' education, where by 2000, they had actually overtaken boys as far as education. So that kind of, at least circumstantially, kind of suggests that the garment sector might be a contributing factor. Next slide, please. In some work I did with Mushfiq Mubarak in 2015, we formally tested the link between the garment sector jobs and girls' education. So we did a survey of households in kind of peri-urban area of Dhaka, and we kind of selected some villages that were within commuting distance of garment factories and some that were not. This is an area where factories typically don't have dormitories, and so we could kind of get access to workers in their homes and not worry about factories kind of gatekeeping who they would let us to talk to. And so we collected a lot of information about the kind of offspring of the household head, their education, their marriage and childbearing, and if they migrated, we know that too. So to kind of estimate what we hope is a causal impact of the garment sector, we compared enrollment in these villages near garment factories, garment proximate villages, to those in the kind of control villages that weren't within commuting distance. And we did that before versus after the garment factories open. So that kind of alleviates some concerns that maybe villages that are near garment factories are just different for other reasons than just the garment factory. It could be that garment factories arise in villages that, where women are already more educated, for instance. But by comparing the same village before versus after garment factories open, that alleviates that concern, because we're kind of only comparing the same village at different points in time. Next slide, please. So it looks like the garment sector, what we found was that the garment sector did increase education, and this was particularly true for young girls. So these charts show the impacts by age of the girl, and so you see just kind of stronger effects at younger ages, and they're pretty big effects. So, for instance, an 8-year-old girl is 13 percentage points more likely to be in school compared to a girl in a control village. As you see, the effects get smaller for older girls, and so this is consistent with some degree of girls dropping out. But importantly, they don't become negative. They just become roughly a 0, and so it's not kind of detrimental for the older girls. It's just not as kind of positive as far as increased education. Next slide, please. Kind of the punchline of these results is that the garment sector can kind of explain 2.8 percentage points of that national increase that I showed you earlier. So it wasn't the only thing that was changing, but it's kind of an important contributor to that overall kind of national trend whereby girls' education overtook boys' education. Next slide, please. But as we saw from that first picture, working conditions in these factories are really tough. So, Rana Plaza was the biggest disaster as far as kind of the human scope of the tragedy, but there was a high profile fire the year before that also killed many workers, and kind of many other accidents. Even for workers that kind of, didn't get in an accident that hurt or killed them, they're still kind of often tough places to work. There's anecdotal reports of abuse from management, whether it's verbal, physical, or sometimes even sexual abuse. Sometimes workers kind of get paid late, or they're asked to work overtime and not paid for it. And there are indeed also reports of blocked fire exits. So, even if there's not a fire, it's probably kind of very scary to work in a factory with this occurring. So these are kind of all things that likely take their toll on workers. And some evidence from Ethiopia in kind of a similar light manufacturing context, working in a factory almost doubled the rate of physical disability. So that's some kind of similar evidence that these are really hard places to work. Next slide, please. So I'll just kind of talk briefly about kind of how we might think that policy could make these jobs better. And so the first that I'll talk about is kind of the role of migrant workers in factories and kind of the information they might have about working conditions. Next slide, please. So in this work, which is joint with Laura Boudreau and Tyler McCormick, we kind of take the context that we look at is kind of before Rana Plaza and kind of think about how might working conditions have gotten so bad that in the extreme the factory did collapse. In the paper, we document some facts about the careers of workers who migrated to garment factories from elsewhere in the country, from rural areas, compared to kind of locals who grew up near garment factories. What we find is that migrants work in factories with worse working conditions. And there might be kind of many reasons why that's the case. They might just kind of be, overall just kind of not have as good job opportunities. But then we find that if anything, migrants are in factories that pay higher wages. And then the last fact that we document is that migrants move toward factories with better conditions with experience. Next slide, please. So we interpret those facts by kind of pointing out that they're consistent with a model in which migrants are poorly informed about working conditions when they begin work, but later on they learn about kind of these working conditions as they gain experience and start behaving more like the locals do and move towards the factories with better working conditions. So the policy implication here is to provide workers information about working conditions that will both help workers find their preferred factory, a factory with good working conditions, but ideally would even give factories incentive to improve working conditions if workers kind of know about these conditions and flock to the factories with better conditions. In practice, where might this information come from? It could come from, kind of audits that happened after Rana Plaza through organizations called the Accord and the Alliance. There's also some NGOs that use worker hotlines to kind of report to kind of report kind of any bad working conditions. And in some ongoing research, we're actually kind of looking at what happens when you give information back to workers. Next slide, please. Okay, so the next thing I'll talk about is kind of the effect of retailers' responses to Rana Plaza. Next slide, please. And this is joint work with two colleagues who are at the World Bank. So, broadly, what happened after Rana Plaza? So, as I just mentioned, there were some initiatives that happened after Rana Plaza, the Accord and the Alliance, which are kind of broadly a system of voluntary audits. So, the factories weren't required to, but to do so by, say, the government, but retailers kind of often felt it was a good idea and encouraged the factories they buy from to do so. And, at the same time, they also just put pressure on factories to improve working conditions. There were also a lot of worker protests that ultimately led to a minimum wage increase. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of say all these things could have impacted workers. We're going to estimate the net effect of all these reforms by comparing workers' outcomes in the garment industry to those in other manufacturing industries before versus after Rana Plaza. And we can also look at kind of in particular at workers in kind of export heavy districts that that were probably particularly affected by by the kind of change in retailers' behavior. Next slide, please. So we found that working conditions did improve, and by a pretty big effect. If you've kind of have a statistical background and kind of roughly have a sense of what one standard deviation is, that's kind of a big, it's a pretty big change. And we found almost a standard deviation increase in working conditions, as far as kind of several kind of reports or kind of a measure that we constructed through workers' reports of things like, did they get sick leave, were they abused, and that kind of thing. The kind of cool thing from a policy standpoint is that did not come at the expense of wages. You might think that if you make factories kind of improve working conditions, they'll try to skimp on wages, but we actually found that wasn't the case. If anything, wages actually went up as well. And so what this suggests is that factories did have some degree of monopoly power beforehand in the labor market, and so that when they were kind of prompted by retailers to share some of their profits with workers, they did so. Next slide, please. Sorry, this is when I told you I updated them because after kind of new findings, I accidentally this slide was accidentally still in there, so we can skip it. We used to kind of we used to be worried that wages had fallen, but then the latest information we got actually said wages kind of had gone up too. So it was kind of a very kind of positive finding. And then just briefly, I'll just talk kind of about one more project about the role of women's economic empowerment and intimate partner violence. And next slide, please. So, if we think about what happens to intimate partner violence when women gain economic empowerment, such as getting a job, the kind of theory says, several things could happen. It's possible that job opportunities could lower intimate partner violence, and that's because we think that kind of having a better outside option, what we call kind of what happens to you if you leave a marriage, that's called your outside option, that leads to better treatment within a marriage, and including kind of less violence. And there's a paper I cite here from the US that indeed finds that. But in other circumstances, it could be that actually job opportunities could increase violence. And there's kind of a couple things that might go, that might be behind this. So, if there's, if a woman's bringing in money from a job, it gives, it gives them kind of more money that they have to kind of bargain over and potentially lead to fights over, and that could spill over into violence. And there's a couple papers, including some work I've done, that find that, that this can be the case. There's also kind of some psychology literature that points out that kind of men might feel threatened by, women kind of becoming empowered, and they might lash out against that. So kind of theoretically, we're not sure which will happen, and so that kind of leads us to want to kind of see what happens in the data as far as women's economic empowerment, and does that lead to violence? Next slide, please. So a very recent working power. I think we accidentally went 2 slides. Okay, let's try kind of one more. Maybe I had the order wrong. Okay. Yeah, and so I kind of, this is broadly on the kind of literature. There's one other paper in the garment sector context in Bangladesh that that found that working indeed might increase intimate partner violence. And then kind of some experimental evidence in other settings, kind of find some success at kind of, if you kind of combine economic empowerment with another intervention, like kind of training about HIV or what's kind of called a gender dialogue, that actually can kind of reduce the violence that women face. But, in other experiments, there was really no effect at least on average, of economic empowerment on violence. Next slide, please. In kind of a recently completed working paper that we're still kind of, we're still kind of further developing, the context that we're looking at is the post-conflict Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo. And the intervention we look at is women getting business training plus a stipend. So kind of two ways to get them economic empowerment. We also had kind of a treatment arm that where kind of men participated in the training to try to see if that kind of helps, lead to better relationship with in the couple. So on average, we found that there was not a change in intimate partner violence. So that you might think that that means the training had no effect on the economic empowerment had no effect on women, but instead what it looks like is that some women suffered less violence, and actually encouragingly, we found that the women who faced less violence after the training were actually those most at risk of violence to begin with. So those high-risk women benefited, but unfortunately, that kind of that also implies that women that kind of previously were not facing violence actually kind of faced more. So on average, that kind of ends up being a zero, but that that kind of is masking the fact that some women were helped and others were hurt by the intervention. And I should mention, just kind of ethically, this is, you want to be kind of very careful not to, kind of do an experiment that leads to violence. But this was a program that was running, that was going to be kind of done anyway. And so we wanted to see, was it leading to violence? But, even if we hadn't studied it, the program would have happened. Next slide, please. So just to wrap up, it's kind of argued that garment sector jobs can, provide important access to income. It's often kind of higher than what women's alternative options would be. And I showed you some research that, there's effects not just on the kind of current workers, but also girls who can get jobs in the future and are enrolled in school. There's several ways in which policy interventions can kind of help labor markets function more efficiently. So kind of further increasing welfare to, help women get the benefits of these jobs without kind of some of the risks as far as working conditions. And there are kind of some big open questions that, I'm still working on, others are too. Are there other jobs that, are there other interventions that kind of can improve wages and working conditions, like the Rana Plaza response paper? We don't want to have to wait for a tragedy for workers to benefit from, both increased wages and working conditions. And another open question are, we found that our intervention on average didn't lead to a change in violence. But I think there's kind of still a bunch of research that's trying to put together an intervention that can, on average, decrease intimate partner violence. Great. Well, thanks everybody for letting me kind of talk about some of my research.
Thank you so much for sharing. I think we're all amazed at the findings, and just really interesting, looking at both sides of what it can and can't do. There's already multiple questions in the chat, but just out of respect for Professor Jacobs' times, I'm going to let him present first, and then agglomerate all the questions at the end.
Yeah.
So I'll go ahead and let Professor Jacobs talk about his next part.
Hi. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Shoaib, and the Bridges Center. Thank you to Professors Jacoby and Heath. I know I have many questions that I would love to hear about from the two of you over time as well. So I'll try to keep mine quick, and we can pass by my profile here because I Shoaib's already told you about it. So what do I do? Well, I generally don't consider myself first and foremost a labor economist. I rather generally think of myself as a microeconomic theorist who applies my research to questions in labor economics and to a lesser extent in an industrial organization. And the questions I've studied have a few sort of broad connections maybe between them, but fundamentally they are not necessarily tightly related. I've studied things like how firms can effectively manage large numbers of employees using contracts that respond to the the behaviors that the employees are observed performing, and I've studied I'm studying how and why firms conduct job interviews when there's plenty of evidence from literatures in other fields, such as management, that suggest that firms are really bad at conducting job interviews, and firms are not normally known for doing things that lose them money or spending lots of money in order to lose money. So why is it that firms are interviewing? But the research that I'm going to talk a little bit about today is about how students can finance college education and the impact that this financing choice ends up having when students apply for jobs when they're done with school. If you could advance. As I said, I don't normally think of myself primarily as a labor economist, but rather as an economic theorist. And this is because I'm often interested in questions that simply cannot be studied empirically with data, or that cannot yet be studied empirically with data. Sometimes it's because the question is normative rather than positive. I want to ask a question about what is the best way of doing something, what is the theoretical optimal way of doing something, as in that contracting research that I've done. But other times it's because research with data simply cannot yet be done. And that's going to be the case with the research I'm going to talk about today with the college financing. And that's because the financing tool that I'm going to be talking about, these income share agreements, did not exist really, at least not in the modern era, until 2016. And because I'm particularly focused on labor market outcomes of students who had these agreements while they were in school, the first cohorts of students that ever had any of this option for this financing did not graduate until, well, unfortunately, the start of the pandemic, which kind of throws everything into question. But even if it were not for the pandemic, we'd have 2 years of labor market data from the earliest cohorts of students to get these agreements underway. So it's just simply not feasible to attack these questions with data, but we still want to learn whatever we can about these topics, and this is a perfect role for economic theory. If you could advance. So what are these agreements? Well, most, I actually don't have evidence. I don't know off the top of my head if it's most, but I believe it's most. Many students borrow money to pay for college. But instead, the question is, what if you could share, what if you could sell shares of your future income in exchange for tuition money? So companies, when firms want to raise money for their operations, they can issue debt in the form of corporate bonds, or they can issue stocks, which raise money by selling shares of their future income, selling shares in the firm. And the question is, well, why can't individuals do that as well? Why can't, instead of taking on a loan, you sell a share of your future income in exchange for some upfront money? And that means then if you get a high-paying job, you'll be making a lot of money and you'll be paying a large amount of money to your benefactor. But on the other hand, if you get a low-paying job, you're not going to pay, well, much of anything in exchange for this tuition money that you got initially, because there is no loan at any point in this process. There's also no principal you have to repay. There's no specific amount of money you're on the hook for. If you get a high-paying job, you pay a lot. If you get a low-paying job, you don't pay much at all. Next slide, please. And so the questions that I wanted to answer were taking this novel financial concept and asking, well, is this going to be helpful for students in the long run through their careers? What kind of students might benefit from this and what kind of students might be harmed by this? Will it make it easier or harder to find jobs? And will more students go to college? This last topic actually wasn't one I was initially focused on answering, but became focused on answering once I saw that the marketing materials from some of the firms offering this financial product were saying that, yes, indeed, more students will be able to go to college if they use this product. And so because this firm was suggesting that this was a benefit of their product, well, it wouldn't have been possible to get data on it because it's too new to be able to evaluate that way. But fundamentally, is it possible for this sort of financial tool to make college more attractive to students who would otherwise be unable to attend? Next slide, please. And so why is it that we would think that financing choices might impact job search? Why is it that financing choices matter at all? After all, if you're going to college, then you learn certain things. Why should how you chose to pay for college impact your job search? Well, there are a couple of reasons. The first is that because your repayment, if you've sold a share of your future income, because how much you pay is directly tied to your income, there's a fundamental difference between paying for college using debt and paying for college using equity, using these income share agreements. While you're searching for work in the time between going to school and finding a job, you don't need to pay anything at all with an income share agreement, while in debt, while there are, with a traditional student loan, there are mechanisms whereby you can decrease your liability. You can essentially afford to wait longer to get the right job if you have an income share agreement. But also, one thing that's fundamentally interesting to me about income share agreements is that unlike in debt, the person that's providing you the money has an incentive for you to get a better job. If somebody gets a larger sum of money paid to them because you have a good job, they want to get you a good job. If you've borrowed money from the government or from a bank to pay for college, you owe them X dollars regardless of your income. They don't have any incentive at all to help you get a higher paying job or to help you get a job faster. Next slide, please. And so I don't want to show you all of the technical details of my research because I would like you to find studying economics using theory very interesting instead of very scary. So I'm not going to show you all the calculus and all of the math, but I want to again try to hint at why some of this sort of research is so cool. So this is some marketing material from this first ever income share agreement that was put in place in 2016 at Purdue University. It's not a loan and you're not alone. And the fund, I love the name of this, is the Baca Boiler Fund because Purdue is the boiler makers. Next slide, please. And so it's sort of aggressive marketing, as I think is perfectly exemplified by this chart, which you could also find on the Purdue University Baca Boiler website, in addition to the website of the firm known as Vemo Education, VEMO, that provides these income share agreements to students. Well, on the left, you'll see loans. On the middle, you'll see these income share agreements. And on the right, you'll see scholarships. And you'll see check marks where Vemo Education and Purdue suggest that there is a benefit of this particular financing tool. So loans do not have an academic or grade requirement, but do require full repayment of the amount of money initially borrowed. Do not have, do have a long-term obligation with this principal balance, which is the same thing as no full repayment requirement. It's the same idea put twice, and does accrue interest, and it takes between 10 and 20 years to pay off your loan. The income share agreement, they claim, has no academic or grade requirements, does not require you to pay off your principal in full, does not accrue interest, and these agreements generally last for 10 years or less. And what is absolutely the funniest thing about this chart to me is that that's contrasted then with scholarships, which have all the same properties there as income share agreements, but require an academic or grade requirement according to their marketing material. So what's funny about this chart to me is that they seem to be claiming that these income share agreements that require you to pay something like 6 or 7% of your income over the course of, say, 100 months, about 8 years after you graduate, they're saying that these agreements are somehow better than getting scholarships, which seems like a little bit more aggressive marketing than could possibly be accurate. Next slide, please. And so why is it then that students use income, or when students use income share agreements, what is it that happens? Well, I've developed a model of labor search that can accommodate these income share agreements. And what I can show is that indeed students will wait for higher paying jobs when they have income share agreements, or at least that optimally students would be best off waiting for higher paying jobs if they have an income share agreement than if they have debt. And when they get these jobs, they generally do get higher paying jobs. Unfortunately, they do have to pay a share of their income to their provider. And this amount that they have to pay to their provider is sufficiently high that overall the wage that you get to put in your pocket goes down. And it takes longer to get a job. There is going to be an increase in frictional unemployment using these income share agreements as students wait longer for these higher paying jobs. I also find that because there is this incentive for the firms to help you get a better job if they're giving you this money, well, if they are going to do so, if they are able to do so, then they might be able to do so by, say, putting your resume on the top of a stack and calling up the employer that they know and say, hey, take an extra careful look at this employee. Well, when that happens, wages do potentially go up enough to make the take-home pay of the employee actually rise overall. However, that does not mean that students will get a job faster. Sometimes they might get jobs faster, and sometimes they might get jobs more slowly. Who benefits most of all? Students with middle incomes benefit the most, although that's in scare quotes on the slides, because unfortunately with this kind of theoretical research, it's not necessarily possible to know what middle income really means. What instead we know is that there is some threshold where if you need to raise more money than that threshold, income share agreements are not the best way to do it. And there is another threshold where if you are below that threshold, if you need very little money, additional money to be able to pay for college, then you just want to do it with debt. So only students that are in between these thresholds benefit most. Next slide, please. So what is the best possible way that students can pay for college? What is the sort of optimal way we could design a policy where students could get extra money before going, or for tuition when they're going to college? Well, I can show that it's always possible for students and these providers to be able to bargain in such a way that there is a better income share agreement policy than the debt that student would be able to take on. However, this policy changes dramatically from student to student, and so it's unlikely that these income share agreements will be able to help very many students if they are standardized. And this is a fundamental thing I see again and again with these results, is that these income share agreements help students the most if they are tailored to the individual student's needs, and that without that sort of tailoring, then these income share agreements are unlikely to provide the benefits that are contained in the marketing materials that these firms offer. Next slide, please. Or actually, I guess, yeah, that's what I have.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, is there anything else you wanted to add without a slide?
No, I think that is the extent of that research, at least without showing the technical, gory details of the math.
Yeah, and I'm sure a lot of people appreciate that too. It makes like the results and like the thinking throughout the research so much easier to understand for someone who hasn't done that training. But Again, really interesting paper. I love the shift in perspective from loans as something that's predatory to ISAs as something is, here's equity. I see myself as valuable and you should too.
Well, I should suggest that many people do view this product as inherently predatory. In fact, when Professor Jacoby was mentioning his work on apprenticeships and suggesting that these contracts were seen, these apprenticeship contracts were seen as a form of involuntary servitude. Well, in fact, you'll see that often in the media when the media discusses income share agreements, that this is I believe that Senator Warren referred to these products as indentured servitude. And I'm not sure whether, and in fact, when I first heard about this product, I sort of felt quite similarly. And now I'm no longer sure that I do. Well, or at least that to the extent that I feel that these are a form of indentured servitude, I think that they are no more so than debt is. But we are so used to thinking about debt. One of the most fundamentally strange things for me when I was doing this research is getting myself to unlearn thinking of debt as this inherent norm or natural way of paying for school.
Great. Well, I mean, I think it's okay to move to the Q&A slide now. Before I go on to the questions from the chat, I know we all have to go at 5 o'clock, so we will answer those in the chat. I mean, since it's recorded, I'll post this on YouTube for everyone to see afterwards. But does anyone who's present here want to unmute or put in chat any questions that they might have? If not, I can go ahead and okay, I think I can read some questions. I'll give the first one to Dan Jacoby because it's been a while since he's gotten to say something. I think Carolyn, Professor Tarnowski, who I'd head out a little early, she was wondering if you examine different forms of work in factories like apprenticeships to assess the range of vulnerabilities and abuses or improvements in policy intervention. And Daniel, you're muted. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that under the Fitzgerald regulations, I don't think there's as many abuses of apprenticeship anymore. I mean, we see apprenticeships heavily in the building trades. We see them in machinist industry. We see them in shipbuilding. We see them in a few other areas. There, a number of people are trying to use them in computers. But the way in which the apprenticeship system works is to try to make sure that the wage is always above the minimum wage and is always graduating up over a period of time. That they're in that way, the modern apprenticeships don't have that many abuses in the traditional sense. I mean, there's always concerns about whether or not the workplace is a productive workplace, whether or not people are harassing. Issues around gender discrimination and harassment arise continuously in the building trades and other trades. So that remains. But in terms of employers, I think you've kind of taken out most of the worst aspects of it. I think, and the biggest issue left is that it's just harder to get people interested in them because you're doing so much to protect the employees. It is a relatively expensive process. And that has been part of the reason why I think we're not seeing as many people glom onto apprenticeships as we would like. The skill shortages of the last few years until the COVID situation were really starting to lead a number of employers to take on apprenticeships that hadn't done it before. And we may see that happening again as if the low unemployment level remains. I hope that answers the question. I think I understood it.
Yeah, I think so too. And Rachel or Professor Heath, if you have anything to add, because I think that might have been tying to your research.
Yeah, no, I certainly kind of agree with that. Kind of with kind of respect to the specific garment industry context. I mean, we don't in practice see kind of anything like an apprenticeship, but there are kind of really strong returns to experience in garment factories. So in some ways, it's kind of a a similar kind of model where you're, kind of at the beginning, you don't earn as much as, you will kind of later on as you gain more experience. But yeah, it's, and it kind of, I guess, relates to the, to the kind of work I found on, kind of workers kind of often having, enduring kind of poor working conditions at the beginning of work, that it's kind of a particularly vulnerable time for many workers.
Okay, and then one more question from Becca Peach to Rachel, Professor Heath again, was how do companies use women's affect and physical appearance to create surplus value, which incentivizes companies to ensure gender hierarchies are maintained on both inside and outside the workplace? And continuing the question, Becca says, is there any way to change the incentive structure so that this form of exploitation is less beneficial to companies?
I mean, I guess I'm sure, that happens in kind of certain industries. Like my kind of read of the garment industry is because it's, it's all kind of done in factories that are not like as much in the public view. It's not really about, appearance per se, but it certainly is the case that, that factories are kind of, using women's labor to, to make profits. And so, I mean, so I do think like if we're kind of trying to return to the question of, what's a way to compel companies to, to share some of these profits with their workers. As I mentioned, I think we don't want to, it hopefully doesn't, need, hopefully just in say other labor markets around the world, it hopefully doesn't take a tragedy on the scale of Rana Plaza to kind of prompt firms to do that, to share profits with workers. So yeah, I think, minimum wages are one way where, when firms have some monopoly power, those can be helpful tools. And so that's kind of something to look out for, as well as kind of anything that kind of, any intervention that kind of empowers workers. So maybe kind of providing them with information about, salaries in other firms to kind of try to make firms kind of compete more for workers might be effective as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. Maybe a question for Professor Jacobs, and Professor Heath and Jacoby can answer after Jacobs. Is how would your research inform policy, like in the real world? How would it actually work?
Absolutely. So I because this work is not empirical. I like to think of this work not as necessarily informing policy directly, but instead as informing future research. So I think it's very important as a theorist to try to write research in a way that is still falsifiable. And so when data becomes available in the future, that I can help using my work to guide empiricists in what is it that the literature suggests we might expect out of studying these income share agreements and studying the employment and job search patterns of students with these financing tools. So I don't think that in this particular instance, it's necessarily directly I wouldn't feel comfortable advising on policy just on the basis of this research alone. And I think that sometimes theoretical research can do that. But in this case, I would wait for empiricists to be able to come along and answer questions with real data, with the hope that what I'm doing can help them with their research. Or potentially myself doing that research once that data becomes more available.
Yeah, and Professor Jacoby, if you want to.
If you wouldn't mind, I'd love to just ask Professor Jacobs just one question about his work. And I've come across these share agreements before, and one of the questions that comes up in my mind is, I would think a natural evolution in these share agreements is going to be a risk minimization strategy on the part of the investor, such that they target people who are going into the most lucrative fields. And that's going to be a tendency to narrow down choices of students. You might say that's good economically because they'll go into the most lucrative fields, but it's also, I think, going to have an impact on the range of choices available. What do you think?
Absolutely. So I think that there have been two sort of directions that these real world agreements have gone when facing that issue. One of those is exactly as you said, limiting the access to these programs only to students. What we've generally seen is in business or engineering fields. The other direction that I see this sometimes taking is that it's a little bit more in that direction where instead of using a standardized product that's one size fits all, rather tailoring the terms of the agreement to students based on their major. So we haven't seen a lot of individually tailored agreements where students that are otherwise similar within the same major will get different looking contracts. But we do see the case at some, but not all of the schools offering these products where, say, an engineering student might be offered a 4% contract, whereas an art history major might be offered a 10% contract. And those are numbers that I don't actually know for sure, and I don't want to pick on one particular major or another, but we do see that sometimes. Right now, we're sort of still in the Wild West era of these contracts. They're not regulated nearly as closely as other financial products that are used for education. But that I would imagine that they will either go more in the direction of personalization or be limited very much in scope. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank
you. I'm sorry, what did you want me to comment on?
Oh, maybe how your research would tie to policy, how you would inform policy.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we're definitely seeing a resurgence of interest in apprenticeship. And I think some of it is a little pie in the sky thought. I mean, one of the things that we see a lot of folks advocating is that there are different non-traditional learners that need to have a different portal into well-paying jobs. And I certainly agree with that. I think one of the issues that is starting to emerge is that, as I pointed out, there's been some difficulty in getting younger people in. So oftentimes they're looking for proven individuals who've been around the marketplace for a while. But oftentimes the people who are they're looking for are actually very similar to people who are going into colleges in traditional ways, because they're looking for people with math skills, and they're looking with people with critical thinking skills and a lot of social skills. So sometimes the actual population looks pretty similar, and that may be what's accounting for some of those high rates of default. Yet I think there are ways to move this forward, and I think between share agreements, between apprenticeship, I suspect that there's going to be more attention paid to these kinds of questions. And my hope is that in a policy sense, I would love to see organized labor begin to talk more clearly about apprenticeship more broadly and away from just the traditional building trades, and to thinking more about all sorts of areas where people need to have some protection, which increasingly means people in college.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Does anyone in the Zoom have any questions? Feel free to unmute or drop in chat. I'll pause for a second. If not, Professor Heath, I think one question for you from Rachel Ersted, and this was from chat. Rachel said, I'm interested in research on findings from worker hotlines. So has or could information gathered be helpful in the advocacy and information sharing to other workers?
Yeah, that's certainly the research that we're trying to do is answering exactly that. And not just through hotlines like the labor voices we mentioned, but also just kind of more broadly, like if we collect information from workers and give that information back out, will those have beneficial effects on workers? So it's certainly something that we're trying to answer with our ongoing research.
All right, we got the thumbs up from Rachel Ersted. With that, I think it's okay to close this out. Thank you guys so much for giving your time and sharing these 3 awesome examples of what labor research and economics could look like. Thank you to everyone who attended. I know some people had to head out in the middle of the meeting. It was a long panel, but for sure, very interesting throughout. And thank you to people who stuck all the way through. Hope you guys have a good evening. I'm going to stop the recording now. Feel free to stick around and ask any questions you may have still.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
organizing this.
Yes.
Thank you.
Great.